Welcome to this episode of Metawell. We are glad to be back. As many of you know, my name is Adam Froerer.
I'm Cecil Walker.
Nice to see you, Cecil.
Nice to see you too.
Feels like
Anything
it's
new
been a
going
while.
Oh, that's because you're always traveling. You're in and out all the time.
You know, somebody's got to work around here.
Well, somebody's got to be the one to not work. I'll take that job.
Today, we are going to talk about spiritual well-being. We've talked about lots of different kinds of well-being, and I think this is one of the domains of well-being that maybe we don't emphasize or talk a lot about. And so I'm interested to hear what thoughts you've got. When you think about spiritual well-being, what do you think that is?
Thing that immediately comes to my brain without overthinking it is purpose, really, like some higher connection to the meaning of what you do and how you live and the actions you take, the decisions you make, how you intentionally choose to live, anything that ties into the explanation of why and the purpose of all those things. And obviously that can be, well structured concepts of religion and faith that, we know of. So practicing a structured religion. But I think there's room for other things that aren't that. Aren't these, very recognized larger religions. But anything that kind of points at or makes sense of some kind of purpose for the sake of time. I'm trying to give concise answers because I'm sure we could go on for much longer than a podcast episode on this.
We tend to have a lot to say. Given that you talk about purpose, this may sound like a dumb question, but if that's the case, if it's about purpose, about the meaning of life, those kinds of things, and I don't know if you're an expert on this or not, but
probably not.
But why do we call it spiritual if there is not necessarily a spiritual realm to it? If we're not talking about, like, I think sometimes when you think about traditional religion, then you can easily incorporate like the metaphysical or the spiritual realm of things or those kinds of things. But if it's simply about purpose, I don't mean simply as like a minimization of what you said, but how does purpose connect to or not spiritual?
Yeah, I am no expert on this. In fact, it's probably a quiz I would fail every time. But my understanding is it's the stuff that's beyond the physical. This podcast is a great place for these conversations because we've talked about all of the things in sort of a basic needs kind of a way. We've talked about like, here's what your body needs. Here's what your emotion and your brain needs. Here's socially these parts of you, what you need. And so you need food, you need physical exercise, you need, all these basic things in a very corporeal sense. But there isn't really a tangibility to the spiritual aspect of it. Because if we gave you everything you need in a very physical sense, you got all of the food that you need. You got all of the, you have adequate socialization, and there's nothing tangible that is really being withheld from you. But what you do day in and day out and how you live your life seems to be totally lacking any sense of meaning and purpose. Physically, there's nothing wrong, but you would still notice a lack, I think. And so I think that's how my brain digests this, the spiritual being something beyond what is physically there. And I think regardless of what people subscribe to in terms of faith and belief, everybody needs to feel like what they're doing is justified with meaning and purpose. Whatever way you make sense of the time you have on earth and the way you live day to day and the reasons you make the choices that you make, that you do make, it's got to be something that kind of endows that with a sense of there is some meaning here. Then otherwise, like you're just, I don't know, like a tree. Sure, you can survive, but you function with much more capability than just who exist.
Yeah, I think you're right. One of the things that I kind of like about this, and it kind of actually reminds me of there's a researcher, and his name is John Fisher, and he created a spiritual well-being questionnaire. And one of the things that I like about what you're saying that he also kind of captures is that there's kind of this you used a really big word that if people listeners don't know, then they are going to have to go look it up. But you use the word corporeal because you're super smart.
No, that was an accident.
Well, then you know you're really smart if you're using big words accidentally. Sometimes people fake intelligence by using big words intentionally, but accidentally says something entirely different.
Well, my philosophy is test drive them. Try some big words, see how it works for you. If they land, they land. If you don't know what they mean, try some different ones.
But one of the things that I really like about what you're saying is like it's the kind of the flip side of the tangible, the physical, the temporal experience that we have. And Fisher kind of in his questionnaire kind of highlighted four different domains. And what I think is really interesting about the domains that he highlighted is that he kind of talked about, or Fisher kind of talked about how like spiritual well-being is what he kind of called relational harmony. And relational harmony, we've already talked a little bit about like social well-being. So it kind of begs the question, what's different between relational well-being and spiritual well-being? And he highlighted four kind of domains that we can go through one at a time. But the first domain is what he called the personal domain, which on the surface sounds like, well, how could that be relational harmony if it's personal? But he talked about it as like my identity and self-worth, how I relate to myself, how self-aware am I, how much of a sense of purpose do I have? And I think that idea of like self-awareness and purpose gets at what you were talking about of like it's something beyond just the tangible world that we're in. Why am I here? What am I supposed to accomplish while I'm on the earth? Those kinds of things. The second domain that he talks about sounds a bit more intuitive, which is what he called the communal domain. And this is where we like what relationship do we have with other people? But one of the things I think is really valuable about what he's talking about beyond just relationships, because again, that's kind of a tangible, like how well do I feel connected to you? He then incorporated concepts like love and justice and hope and forgiveness and trust and these kinds of things where it's like if those like non-tangible things are present, then I know that I have a bit of that communal relationship, that relational harmony with friends, family, people around me. And then the third domain is something that I wouldn't necessarily have thought about as far as like spiritual domain. But once I kind of considered it, then it was like, oh, of course, that makes complete sense. And this third domain is the environmental domain. And this is the relationship or the connection that I have with nature. And again, once I kind of looked at it and studied it a bit, it's actually one of my favorite parts of the spiritual domain because he uses words like wonder and awe and like just this connection. Like if I can feel connected to the larger world, it's not that I'm physically connected, but there's this like emotional connection, or there's this, again, kind of the domain that we're talking about, this spiritual connection of like, we have something in common with everything here on the earth, any living thing we're kind of connected to. And then the fourth domain, it's not till it gets to the fourth domain that's where it kind of turns to what we might typically think of as spiritual, which is what he calls the transcendental domain. And this is then the connection with, for people who are religious, who are or are spiritual, it might be the connection to God or Allah or the spirit or some kind of divine being. But he also incorporates an idea of, for people who are non-theistic, and this is where he gets to kind of what you were talking about, like this higher purpose or like an ultimate reality or like what is existence, those kinds of things. So how do I connect to anything that's beyond me. And I think one of the things that I really value about the way that he laid that out is that it's really comprehensive. From like me as an individual, I can be asking myself, what's the whole purpose of this? All the way through to like these grand philosophical ideas or these transcendental ideas around like, what's this all for? How do I connect? What's the purpose of this process? And so as you think about and hear about these kind of four domains that Fisher laid out, what thoughts or ideas or what comes to your mind about why this might be helpful or why this might not, or where there might be some missing pieces maybe?
Well, what I'm wondering is I would have never thought to separate them into these domains, especially, I mean, I was right there with you. These categories aren't what I would have intuitively thought about in terms of spiritual well-being. What's the purpose to having these particular categories? Is he saying that we should tend to these areas and make sure that we are, so to speak, these are like the vitamins of our spirituality that we have to kind of make sure we get what we need from these four areas?
He doesn't really necessarily talk about it as vitamins, but one of the things that he does talk about is that people have they have a strong sense of spiritual well-being when there is harmony across the four domains. So when I feel like my own my own self-awareness is in line with my family, my friends, with what the divine being or this higher power might want for me, am I living in harmony with the universe, with the world around me? Then when there's harmony across the domains, then I feel a sense of spiritual well-being. Then I sometimes I think he also talks about like if there's a mismatch, right? Of like if I'm really self-aware, but I have a disconnect from this larger transcendental thing, that it can signal then a point of spiritual crisis or a spiritual disaster or even a place of like spiritual growth. If I'm out of harmony, maybe that tells me, okay, I could focus on developing a sense of identity around this, and that's going to help me to feel a bit of harmony throughout. I guess maybe I'll stop there. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, that answers it perfectly. And that makes me think of, this particular area of well-being as being then an act of trying to optimize congruence within yourself, which I very much can see as being, the case for spirituality across the board, regardless of this is someone who's religious or someone who's not, trying to be congruent in what it is you say you believe and the actions that you're taking or the way that you're living your life, trying to be congruent between, what values you have and what you say is the ideal way to live your life, and then how that plays out in real terms and in what you're doing and choosing and acting and how you engage with people. To look at all of these areas, these domains, then and to try to reach some type of congruence across them within yourself, between you and other people, within the world and in the environment, as well as your connection to a deity or some higher purpose, higher power. That then I think would require what seems to come up a lot in all of these areas of well-being, in intentionality, to be able to sit and think very carefully about, okay, not only what is it that I do believe and am subscribing to, but what's a good objective assessment of where I'm at in these areas, so I can start to try to pull these together to be more congruent. What that starts to tell me is that a big component of spiritual well-being is really knowing yourself, is being able to speak with yourself, have honest, genuine, vulnerable moments with yourself, and be able to look at and think about and then project into the future how you want to kind of navigate your life and then the way that you're going to make meaning of things, which I think isn't something to be taken for granted. I don't think everybody does that for all different kinds of reasons, but I do think that's an important component here to finding a way to enhance your spiritual well-being.
Hmm. Yeah, I do think that, and it's interesting that you talked about intentionality because that's something that came to my mind as well. Like even just from that fundamental domain, that personal domain of like self-awareness. I have to know what is important to me, what I value, those kinds of things. I have to have to kind of be seeking for purpose, trying to live in line with purpose. So that did come to my mind. And I know that that comes up quite a bit as we talk about well-being, is that it's not just something that happens, but it's something that we have to be intentional about. But the other thing that really strikes me, and we talked about this in other kinds of well-being as well, but the other thing that really strikes me is this idea of relational. This is all about relational harmony. And it seems like this idea of relationships comes back over and over and over in a sense of well-being. And I'm wondering what you make of that. Like why do relationships and the quality of our relationships, why do you think that specifically connects to this idea of spiritual well-being, but why is it something that we keep finding over and over as we study this? Is like it all comes back to relationships and intentionality quite a bit. Those are the two things we come back to over and over.
Well, I think for human beings, and I think there's plenty of evidence to support this from all corners of how someone could study people, from an anthropological corner, from a sociological, biological, psychological, any lens you want to look through. There seems to be a relationships are a hallmark of human thriving. For people to exist well in any time period you look at, ancient history, pre-ancient history, modern times, medieval times, whenever you want to look, if someone is living well and functioning well and living a life, that is trying to reach its fullest and maybe even meeting what its fullest capability is, there's a very strong social aspect to that. And that changes maybe over the years what the possibilities of those aspects are, but it always has something to do with how do I relate to the social systems that are here. How do I fit into my role as a family member, as a society member, as a member of a community, or a member of whatever my job is, member of whatever the economic ecosystem is, whether that's we're in some kind of hunter-gatherer horde or we're in a local, capitalist market kind of a community, whatever that looks like. People have to be able to fulfill some type of a social need, I think, which includes identifying and understanding what your roles are to the community, to the system, to other people. And then I think that seems to find its way into all these other parts of ourselves because we're so dependent on that. And that is just, I mean, it's kind of like one of the basics to us. It's just like, our skeletal system is probably going to be a part of everything we do. And so will our relational identity, the way that we relate to other people, to other things, to systems, all of that. And, we first started this conversation about, I think one of the first words I said was purpose and being able to make meaning of things. And I think nothing could really be more closely tied to purpose than how do I relate to everything around me, to people around me. That has to be intertwined with purpose. Purpose has to be intertwined with that. Whichever one you started with, I don't know, but one probably is going to go into the other.
I think one of the things that I really appreciate about Fisher's domains is that it kind of highlights the gravity of it all. Like it's on the one level, it's like it's big, right? It's that I know my self-worth, that I am valuable, that I can have an impact and a connection. Like to think about, like I could have a connection with deity. That's a big concept that has like significant ramifications. And at the same time, it kind of it like almost juxtaposes like smallness. And I know we've talked about smallness in other arenas before, but like this idea of being connected to the world and like being in awe and having a sense of wonder and like going out and like looking at a sky full of stars, or going out into the redwood forest and seeing like the largest trees that exist on our planet, and recognizing like in the grand scheme of things we're so little. And so it's one of the things I find so interesting about these domains is that it really is kind of all encompassing, from like appreciating and understanding the smallness that we have, and getting to how big or how much potential there possibly is. And I'm wondering, as you think about that idea around like kind of size and connection and meaning, I think is in there too. Is there value in recognizing our smallness, or is there value in recognizing our potential greatness? How does that impact how we view ourselves spiritually and our spiritual well-being?
I think that's something that is like universally a very important component to spirituality is this juxtaposition between both smallness and all the humility that should come with that, and yet I have a line to, a higher power. Or if you don't subscribe to religion, still, you know, scientifically speaking, you're still small and insignificant and just this tiny, tiny, almost incalculable percentage of this larger picture of the universe. Yet you exist and yet you feel all the things you feel and experience all the things you feel. So you still have this connection to something powerful, something, you know, uh, bigger than what you should have based on how slice of the pie that you do have. So I feel like no matter who you are, where you are, when you are, there is something universal about this juxtaposition. And I think being able to embrace that and find some type of appreciation for that or gratitude in that, humility in that, awe, even, I feel like the collision of those things is what awe kind of is. That I feel like that is like a good centerpiece for spiritual well-being for someone to be able to really fully embrace and acknowledge those things. Because I think if you overlook that, I don't know, it's hollow. Whatever it is that you're participating in is probably much more hollow. Um, and obviously, there's lots of different religions in the world, and they might teach and value different things, but still, I think there has to be some understanding of what is my connection to a greater power or something outside of myself, and how do I account for the fact that I'm just a person, and you could think of that in whatever scale you want to think of it, but you're still just a person. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are the words that came spewing out. So
Yeah, I think it does. I think one of the things that comes to my mind, I guess, as I think about that is the word balance. If we think of ourselves as too small, then we lack confidence, then we lack
mm,
a sense of self-esteem or self-worth, right? If we view ourselves as less than, then we deal with things like anxiety and depression, and those are things oftentimes that we encounter in our mental health work. And so I think we obviously don't want to err on the side of too small. But at the same time, if you err on the side of too big, then you get to a place of like conceit or
mhm.
self-aggrandizement, or like making ourselves like above the law even, or oftentimes we hear about people talking like we're the top of the food chain, and the reality is we are not the top of the food chain. But like erring too far one way or the other, you can kind of feel the balance get out of whack. But if you can find that spot of like, I'm valuable, I have purpose, I am connected to something bigger and more powerful than me, but I'm also an important part of that connection of something bigger and more powerful than me. That balance then kind of leads us back to this word that we've kept using, which is purpose, right? If I can be a part of something bigger than me, and then I have a purpose, I'm useful in some way to something bigger than me. If I have a sense of self-worth, if I understand like what my beliefs and value is, then there's purpose in why I do what I do. I can begin to act with integrity. If we go to that like communal domain of like family and friends, again, like if I'm a valuable part, I'm not more important than other people, I'm not less important than other people within that system, then I give trust, then I receive trust, then I'm willing to give forgiveness, I I deserve respect, right? So all of a sudden, like, the purpose of family and friendship, it kind of comes into play when we find this balance between too small or too big. If I can be in awe, in some sense, I recognize my own smallness, my own insignificance. But at the same time, if I recognize I'm a part of the world, then that also puts a responsibility or to be a good steward, to take care of, because I know if the world falters in some way, that's going to impact me and I'm going to impact it. And so I just think as we kind of wind our way through this conversation, I just keep coming back to this idea of like, we're really kind of seeking balance between big and small. And when we can find that balance, purpose becomes a bit clearer.
Maybe this will be the last thing, but I do have a question. In these other areas of well-being, if someone is not physically well, they might be out of shape or have some type of illness or something like that. If someone isn't mentally well, they might have some type of mental health condition, or, they're depressed, they're something like that. How do you describe someone who is not spiritually well? And maybe there's some overlap. Maybe they also might be depressed, but I'm curious what that looks like if they're on this end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I guess in order to answer that question, I would go back to that like continuum of small to large, insignificant to significant. And I would say when someone is spiritually unwell, I would say that balance is off. They've swayed one way or the other. Either I feel too small, I have no self-worth, I'm not behaving in connection to the spiritual beliefs that I have. I'm not taking care of the world around me. I think isolationist is an example of like I'm only a word that comes to my mind, and I think there's some religious context to this, but is greed or pride, right? Like I deserve everything. I'm more important than somebody else. And obviously that's kind of like pulling into that, like I think too much of myself, the balance of like how big I am. I don't need a God. I don't need other people. I can live in a country where we only take care of ourselves, where we don't have to be thoughtful about the other world citizens. That greed and pride, you can see in that, like if all I do is say my purpose is to take care of me, then the balance is off a bit. We lose the words like integrity and community and responsibility and stewardship, and so you lose those. But you could err on the other side of too small and say like I'm insignificant. I don't have value. I don't have worth. Nothing I could contribute would actually be worthwhile. You can hear in that like this depression, this looking down on myself, this why would a higher being ever even be worried or care about what's going on with me? There's this sense of like abandonment. I think looking at those, like what arises from moving from too far from center, tells us if somebody has like gotten off in the spiritual well-being domain.
Like I said, I knew we would have more than our time allows for us to say about this, but we can keep the conversation going.
We can. We'll come back to it. So we'll do another episode about spiritual well-being. But in the meantime, I'm just wondering, as you think about, not you, Cecil, but the listeners think about their own spiritual well-being, what comes to mind? Why is attending to spiritual well-being an important component of overall well-being? Where do you get it right? Where could you use a little bit more work? Let us know, because this is a topic we don't talk about often. So let us know what you think about spiritual well-being.